and welcome to Quarantine. This is Peter Hirschberg. I am speaking to you with our 23rd show. But this week, we want to visit an issue that is square in the middle of tech and racism and this reckoning that all of America is going through. And in fact, what we're going to do today is revisit our 13th show, The Digital Reckoning and the Algorithms We Use to Make Our World. And this is really a show that's about the technology side of bias that is in our systems, bias and racism. On this show, we're really honored to have Safiya Umoja Noble, who is a researcher and the author of Algorithms of Oppression, and the other great author in America who's looked at bias in the technology we build, Cathy O'Neil, who's the author of Weapons of Math Destruction. And this is particularly relevant because here is a week where we're coming to grips both with inherent racism and also with kind of why is it that we're unable to pull out of our policing and our activities the forces of bias. And as we saw in the last episode, the one that we did on Wednesday that went the magnificent conversation with Cordell Carter from the Aspen Institute, where we went back to the founding documents, the Promise of America, and worked through Dr. King. Why is it we keep committing the same problem? Well, in the digital realm, the way that we encode algorithms, in fact, codes for bias. For example, hiring algorithms, by their nature, by the nature of resumes and who's hired, actually start coding against minorities, people of color. And we've seen with Facebook, the fact that in the 2016 elections, those algorithms actually start driving us apart. So in this episode, which we aired just a couple of weeks ago, it seems even more relevant now. So I want to bring back for our first encore episode this conversation with Mickey, with myself, and with Safiya Umoja Noble and Cathy O'Neil on the digital reckoning and the algorithms that we want to make. And then we'll be back again on Wednesday with Quarantine.
Let's get close, but not so close. We can share from a distance for a time. Don't want to see each other.
Welcome to the 13th episode of Quarantine. I'm Peter Hirschberg. 13th episode. That means that we have been here for now almost 7 weeks, and this is really the week in which across America the conversation is turning from staying home to how do we come out, and what do we come out to? What are we rebuilding? What? How will our cities be different? How damaged is business? How do we bring it back? And on this show, we're going to start getting into some of the principles of what we have to think about as we start bringing things back. Next week, we're going to focus on the global supply chain. We're going to focus on the future of cities. After that, focusing on innovation. And to frame all of this is the realization that in this crisis, our tech companies have probably played a bigger role than ever, and they'll play a bigger role in what comes next. You see this in the power of Amazon or Google or Facebook that have soared. And just under the surface, these companies and the kind of technology approaches they take, in many ways, legislate what our world is like, or set what the world is like. They're not so much governed by the oversight of political bodies, but of either shareholders or people who are kind of sensitive to what's going on. And today's show is going to be on the digital reckoning, algorithms, and the world that we want to make. the kind of choices that we see and that are inherent in both tech companies or inherent in the algorithms that companies use when they make employment decisions or even sentencing decisions, these are all baked in as assumptions or approaches by data scientists or product people, but they often appear as black boxes to us. We accept them because it's tech and it might be true. And the first responsibility in a republic is oversight and knowing what's going on. And that's what we're going to get into today with really two of the foremost thinkers that we have. Safiya Umoja Noble is a researcher and wrote Algorithms of Oppression.
What setting do I
She
go
really
to?
connects what the mechanisms that tech uses or the assumptions that are made, perhaps without a lot of oversight, back to the original sin in the United States. How is it that algorithms take forward bias or racism, and therefore don't give us the country that we want, but reinforce some of the mistakes that we've made? This is a moment in which we can plan, and it's almost a sacred moment where we're reconsidering the assumptions about how we govern. We ought to do it completely with our eyes open. And also joining us, Cathy O'Neil is another mathematician, author, data science, author of Weapons of Math Destruction. Both of them are writing their books around the same time, and this seems like a particularly important time to bring these things onto the table. I don't think this is going to be a particularly easy conversation today, because we're getting into very tough foundational issues of America. But it sure seems like an important one to include folks in as we start thinking about what to go build, because it's foundational to the nature of a republic and one that's driven more and more by technology. So I'm very excited about that. And then joining us towards the end of the show will be Michael Kleeman from BCG, and he is one of the nation's top telecom entrepreneurs and leaders in scenario planning. Scenario planning is really how you start planning for the future when there's a lot of unknown possibilities, and that's exactly what we have in this world today, where we want to be more resilient, but we're dealing with a system of a virus we don't fully understand and an economy we don't understand. And that framing we will use as we go forward into the coming weeks. So this will be an exciting show, and I think an important one. And I have to tell you, preparing for it, I have learned so much. So I'm excited for our guests to share a lot of details. Let's bring Mickey McManus in, our co-host, and who's a good friend of both of today's guests. Mick, take us away on this important exploration today to set us up for the future.
Thanks, Peter. Actually, not a good friend, just a big fan, actually. So I saw Safiya Noble speak about 2 years ago, and I was at this pretty big tech conference in Berlin, and I was getting a little burned out on all the talks, and then suddenly Safiya got up on stage, and I think you could have heard a pin drop with 30,000 people. When she was talking about algorithms of oppression. And then my sister's a school teacher in Chicago, and really trying to explore how to have kids just fall in love with math the same way they fall in love with music, and teachers fall in love with it. And she said, wow, well, if there's one book you need to read about math, it's Weapons of Math Destruction. And I was like, oh, WMD, that's interesting. And when we started talking with Safiya recently, we were like, wow, it would be great to actually have somebody who really understands what's going on with the math and the algorithm side, and someone who really understands what's going on with the social justice side of things. And that's where we started. So I'd love to bring Safiya on and just start the conversation.
Great. Hi, Mickey. Hi, Pete.
How are you doing? I'm so glad you could join us. So Safiya, maybe first, tell us a little bit about yourself, and a little maybe about the book that you put out a little while ago.
Sure.
It's fixed, right?
Well, first,
I know
it's a pleasure to be here, and such a delight to get to be in exchange with everyone who's on the show today.
I can tell you what.
I'm a professor at UCLA. I'm a professor in the departments of Information Studies and African American Studies, and I wrote this book. Thank you for showing it. Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. And I really came to this line of work and research when I was kind of, I guess, thinking about leaving advertising and going back to graduate school. I'd spent a 15-year career in marketing and advertising in corporate America. I'd worked on a lot of blue chip brands. And at the time that I was leaving the industry, there was, just this nascent new idea about search engine optimization, for example, to make our clients more visible on the first page of search engines, because search engines were being viewed by the public as this kind of neutral arbiter of information and products and services. And the prevailing belief was that if you could show up on the first page of a search engine, the public would trust that you were there for a reason. And so as I was going back to graduate school, I was thinking about this, and it was at a time when Google was emerging as kind of the major player in the search engine scene. And universities were entering these partnerships all over the world, at least all over the English-speaking world, with Google, and digitizing books. Huge academic library holdings were being turned over to Google to digitize because these agreements about what Google might be able to do in making all the world's knowledge available or accessible was taking hold. Of course, I recognize this as marketing discourse, and I thought it was fascinating that these public institutions and private universities all over were handing over these assets to be digitized by Google as if they were of no value to the public. And so this kind of opened up my curiosities. And I eventually conducted a study by kind of looking at how Google represents various kinds of communities and identities and people who are vulnerable, children, people of color, women, in our kind of US context. And what I found through the years of research that I did on this book was that people who were vulnerable, people who were marginalized, people who were in numerical minorities in our population, and people who did not have a lot of capital to buy their way to the top as advertisers in an advertising platform, which is what a search engine is, usually did not fare well. They were misrepresented. In the case of women and girls of color, they were pornified. They were represented as pornographic objects. And it was very, very difficult to dislodge misinformation and disinformation about.
Safiya, give me like a really tangible example of this. So even the cover of your book is actually kind of interesting, because it says, "Why are Black women so?" And then Google, autofills: angry, loud, mean, lazy, attractive, annoying, confident, sassy, insecure. It's like sort of trying to tell you what Black women are. Tell me about what happened when you searched like for young Black girls or things like that. Like, give us a tangible example or two.
Yeah, so back then when I wrote the book, when you did a search on the keywords Black girls, sugaryblackpussy.com, I hope this is for an R-rated audience, because it's going to be R-rated. Yeah. Was the first hit. Now it's not that, and also that porn site, and 80% of the first page of search results was pornography or sexually explicit content. It wasn't. First of all, women were the subjects in those websites, yet they were coded as girls. And more importantly, when you think about what would it mean for young Black girls, Latina girls, Asian girls also represented in these pornographic ways, children cannot buy their way to the top of a search engine. They certainly don't have enough capital. They don't have the kind of money that the porn industry has. And the porn industry was really able to optimize a lot of keywords that would drive people to their content. And what was particularly interesting to me at the time was that you didn't have to add the word sex or porn when you searched for Black girls, Latina girls, Asian girls. These identities were synonymous with porn. And again, I think this is tied to a much longer legacy of hyper exploitation, sexual exploitation of women and girls of color in the United States and around the world. And of course, the prevailing logic, and one of the things I try to do in the book, is talk about how does this happen, and what should we be thinking about. People think that what's most popular in a search engine is what rises to the top. And so the question then is, if you are part of a community or a group that isn't in the numerical majority, how would you ever be able to have influence or control over the way that you're represented, or whether misinformation might circulate about you? The other question is, if you can't optimize content because you don't have money, how will you influence? And so these are two major critical factors that influence what happens in a search engine. But more importantly, I think, is what does it mean when we outsource public knowledge and information and education to advertising platforms, be they social media companies, search engines, YouTube, a whole host of digital media platforms where people engage with them like they are fair, neutral arbiters of all of the information that might be out here. They think they're going to find knowledge. And in fact, what we know is that these platforms are deeply implicated in not just misinformation, but disinformation. And in some cases, we might ask the question, to what degree are they implicated in the collapse of democracy? So these are the kinds of questions that this book interrogates. And it kind of starts with something so simple like, what happens when vulnerable communities lose control of their identities? But more important, what are the broader implications for our society of the role of these companies?
You know, when you 10 years ago, when you started sharing some of your research, and you've been doing this for a very long time, probably longer than 10 years. I apologize for that. I don't know the timing, but a decade ago, yeah, when you started sharing this, what did you hear from people, from the academics, from the tech companies, from other things? How did they react to this? You were saying math was racist, or algorithms are racist?
There were a lot of different kinds of ideas 10 years ago. So first of all, 10 years ago, the prevailing logic was that computer code is math, and math cannot discriminate, period. Now, 10 years later, after, quite frankly, I will tell you, a lot of women, scholars and journalists, people of color, LGBTQ, again, people who already have and occupy marginalized identities, after 10 years of taking a lot of body blows, quite frankly, as we went to conferences, as we tried to get journalists or others, mainstream outlets to reconsider the implications of how programming happens, the values that are laden in code, the kinds of decisions that are made, the power dimensions of these platforms. One of our other, your other guests today, Cathy O'Neil, of course, being a very important voice in that. We took a lot of hits in the early days where people just wouldn't believe. And they were so enamored with the platforms that it was impossible to imagine. They just pushed it back on the public and said, well, you're searching wrong. Or maybe I have actually had people say to me, well, maybe Black girls just do more porn. And I think 9-year-old girls do more porn. I mean, are you serious? I mean, how can these illogical arguments be made? Fast forward 10 years, now we see these same logics that were implicated in the kind of research I was doing a decade ago are the same kinds of logics that have fomented what some people characterize as the culture wars, what we might talk about as deepening political strife between the right and the left around the world, not just the United States. Those same logics are at play now as we look at their threats to democracy, or the spread of disinformation, or the calls for genocide in different parts of the world against ethnic and religious minorities, the way in which content, we have now scholars like my colleague Sarah Roberts at UCLA talking about and making mainstream that there's armies of people who moderate content, and that none of these platforms are neutral, and they're not just math. They're actually deeply implicated in the politics of our society.
And I guess I remember hearing about Facebook has content moderators who are given, they have to watch and look at really horrible things 8 hours a day, and they're given like a half an hour to go cry in the stairwell, I guess. And when the leaders of the company are pushed, they're like, well, yeah, no, I mean, that's a job. and it sounds both horrible for them, and it sort of means that, you know, who's really in control of this, and where is it going? You know, it is interesting. In the last year, Stanford and others stood up these human-centered AI initiatives and things like that. What's your reaction to that? I mean, what's your reaction to seeing 10 years ago they were like, well, look, math can't discriminate, and Stanford and other groups obviously are the sort of birthplaces of places like Google and Facebook and others. What's your reaction to them suddenly, you know, coming to Jesus and actually believing something? What do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, again, I think that there have been a number of feminists and critical race theorists and political economists and people who did the hard work of mainstreaming the idea that these platforms are deeply political, and there are serious consequences, and the distribution of those consequences are not even, and they're not fair, and they typically harm vulnerable communities more than others who can insulate and protect themselves from these platforms and their effects, or these algorithms, artificial intelligence. I mean, we can really nuance this. I think that it's interesting that the places who were the former epicenters and maybe still current epicenters of the techno-utopian ideas that technology is going to solve all of our attendant problems are now in charge of ethics, after the rest of us, again, made visible the deeply unethical, immoral, unjust ways in which many of these technologies work in our societies. So, you know, I find that now these places tend to be recipients of huge donations in the hundreds of millions of dollars to do some of the ethics washing work of perfecting algorithms, because again, there's still this idea that if you can tweak or unbias the algorithm, that problems are solved. And I would argue that it's actually not a technical solution, that these are social problems that get re-encoded and re-inscribed over and over and over into data sets that train machine learning, into assumptions that are made to plan for and predict certain types of outcomes. And this means you cannot divorce these kinds of critiques that many of us have levied. And typically people who are at those places are not making those kinds of critiques. So for me, I can tell you that you know, trying to bring about a center for critical internet inquiry at a place like UCLA is, you know, we don't have people ready to hand us hundreds of millions of dollars to do the work of saying, what would it be like to pause and say, maybe some of these technologies should not be made. Maybe they should be regulated in various ways. Maybe there should be some restoration or reparation that must be made for the severe harms that have been meted out through by various companies and through various different types of technologies. Maybe some of these things should be walked back, made illegal. There's all kinds of ways that we could explore. Maybe we should take a slower approach before bringing all these things online. And so people who are interested in those kinds of questions, I think there are fewer spaces, research spaces. Certainly ours at UCLA is one of them, but those places are hard to come by right now. So
well, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that you know, like a UCLA or public institutions, which seem kind of important. They don't get the funding, they don't get the notoriety, because they're also not part of the sort of advertising industrial complex or the technology industrial complex. And you just rattled off, you know, you mentioned Sarah Roberts. We're talking to Cathy O'Neil. You pointed me to somebody at Harvard. There are a whole bunch of people who have actually been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I never hear about them. Honestly, right. I feel like I never hear about them. And this notion, it struck me really deeply, because I tuned in on some of the launch of the Stanford Human-Centered AI initiative, and it was a bunch of old white or savvy tech men or something like that. And I was just kind of like, whoa, what's going on? And you said it's curious that the epicenters of tech utopia are in charge of ethics. When I stumbled on your book and saw you speak and read through it, I was shocked by some of the things that I saw in there, because I guess I just took it for granted, myself. And I kind of understand some of this, but that that somehow this would be more ethical, or that this would be more balanced. And it was a silly assumption on my part, right? It was just I think we don't recognize the slow burn of how these things have changed things. You brought up public institutions like UCLA. I think you told me what percentage
4%.
California's college system is only 4% from the public.
Right.
Other countries, it's 100%. Think of Germany or something. And when I went to University of Illinois, I'm pretty sure it was a very high percentage that was just funded by taxpayer dollars as a public good.
Yes.
So it's almost a collapse of public institutions as well.
That's right. I mean, we have to remember that the public good vis-a-vis public institutions, public universities, public education, public libraries, public media, public health. I mean, these are fundamental to strong democracies where knowledge production, for example, is not completely controlled by corporations. Now, in the state of California, here we have the University of California system, we have the California State University system, we have a robust community college system, and we have a fraction of our budgets come from public taxpayer funding. And part of the reason is because, quite frankly, corporations don't pay taxes. They certainly don't pay their fair share. And so you think about Silicon Valley being the epicenter. I mean, one of Silicon Valley and agriculture being the two most potent, powerful industries in the state of California. And you have one industry that's heavily subsidized by the public, agriculture, and you have another industry, technology, that basically uses the public infrastructure. They hire people from the top universities around the country, including from the UC system. They use our airports, our roads, our postal system, Amazon. They use all the public goods and public resources, but they don't pay back into it. And so what that means is, and one of the reasons why you see something like that initiative you brought up at Stanford, is that then tech companies in this sector can cherry pick the researchers and the places that they want to invest their resources. And so that means that the research, and one of the reasons why my research is less visible, Cathy's is less visible, Joan Donovan, Ruha Benjamin, many of the people who are Mar Hicks, our work is less visible because big tech doesn't cherry pick funding our research. Most of us don't take big tech money to do our research. And that means that engineering schools and other computer science departments and those who are more amenable to being cherry picked, quite frankly, are able to do the kind of research that normalizes these technologies and puts them out front. And I'll add that the risky dimensions of developing AI and other kinds of technologies is subsidized also by the government, by the public. So the National Science Foundation, NSF, and other agencies, they fund the high risk research, make it viable before venture capitalists back it. So the public really loses.
And this reminds me of sort of this notion that the Kleiner Perkins of the world, the VCs of the world, they're the high risk, cool cats who like take on the risk and bring it to market. But the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health funded 40 years worth of research for that breakthrough drug that's now being, touted as things. And I think we miss out on the taxpayers funded that investment. We took the highest risk as part of our public infrastructure, and it's under attack. So tell me a little more, and maybe Peter can come in just for a second, and then I want to kind of pivot a bit. But tell me a little more about what would a case for reparations look like? Like what is the stuff you're working on now, and what are you thinking about, and how would that come about? Because this feels like structural challenges.
I think that one of the challenges that the pandemic has illuminated for many of us is that, and I'm writing right now about how, as we talk about the economy collapsing or high rates of unemployment, the recession, the sector that's really thriving is the tech sector, because everyone is captured, quite frankly. I mean, here we are having this conversation vis-a-vis the internet. So I think we have to ask ourselves why we don't have the resources in the state treasuries and in the federal treasury to really help us provide the kinds of resources, safety nets, and otherwise that need to be there. Why are our university systems so precarious? I just read an article last night about many universities wondering if they're going to have to close their doors. How could we put higher education, public schools, our public health at such peril when we have the richest country in the world here and so much industry? And so these are the kinds of structural questions that I'm asking. And I actually think that the sector that I study is the tech sector, the big tech sector. And my question is, what does this sector owe the public? And to what degree can it keep extracting our data, our time, our attention to its profit and our peril, whether that's
Peter Hirschberg, I have a question for you here. It strikes me that this conversation about extractive tech, which is particularly heinous as it has related to kind of amplifying ongoing racism or bias, but in many ways we're having this across the board, right? People are waking up to the fact that we have extractive capitalism, that we're being mined by tech. People probably were not aware until the 2016 election, the degree to which they were all caught up in a mechanism where they got manipulated, and then they're the product of that. So one of the questions I have here is, here we have this industry that's relatively new and probably only realized how consequential everything it was doing in the last decade. And now there's this reckoning. And my guess is that people in tech are probably, or have many of which are as shocked as the rest of us with kind of where we've arrived. So to what degree is a reckoning kind of a reparations for past things, and to what degree is it correcting, the diversity of who writes code or what these objective functions are, and is the tech industry just completely averse to this, or is there, are they just not aware of responsibility and governance the way that in political stuff we have representative stuff? So I guess it's really two questions. One, to what degree is the tech industry resistant of this? And then secondly, isn't this part of some broader realization that there's a greater responsibility in the sector to all of us?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the second part first. I mean, yes, there is a greater realization. And again, it's because some of us have forced a reckoning and a realization that these products are more than math. At the same time, I think that there's an attempt to capture some of that conversation and, again, ethics wash it, or not denaturalize the role that these companies are playing in our society. So you see this when big tech CEOs say, we'll get together and we'll think about how to self-regulate the industry. Let us put forward, if I'm Facebook leadership, let us put forward the regulations that we'd like to see. And this to me is like a little bit like the fox guarding the hen house. This is like, we've seen this before. For example, when fossil fuel companies said that they'll come up with the regulations, and here we are in a climate crisis that they are deeply implicated in. I think part of what, going to the first question though, is, part of what we are challenged here with is major paradigm shifting. And this is what my work is focused on. You talked about, Peter, in the opening, the original sin, right?
Yeah,
which is the enslavement of African peoples and the occupation of indigenous peoples' lands and so forth, the transatlantic slave trade. So these original sins, there was a time when people argued the American economy and the economy of the Americas, North and South, was wholly dependent upon slavery. And it was unimaginable to stop the trading of slaves and then to, in fact, enact abolition. it was really difficult for people to accept that paradigm shift.
Yeah, we fought a war over changing a business model.
Okay, do you understand?
Yeah.
Fast forward, we did the same thing with big tobacco. Big tobacco, I was sharing with Mickey when we were talking earlier, I'm sure the doctor who delivered me had like a cigarette hanging out of his mouth while I was being pushed out. I mean, all of us had that. When I tell my students that now, they can't even believe that. Yet big tobacco had such a hold on the public's imagination about what was sexy, what was cool, what was actually healthy, what would help you lose weight. I mean, there was the campaigns were immaculate.
Well, even this notion that and I think you said it the other day, and it just really struck me. We have to be really careful about normalizing what we think is wrong, because it's so insidious in some ways.
That's right. And we've normalized big tech in a way that I think deserves the retrospect, like we did on tobacco and like we did on slavery and all kinds, sugarcane and all kinds of other industries. I mean, we would never. Let me just
ask a question about.
No, wait, finish, Safiya. I want to hear this.
We would never let three guys go in a strip mall and make up some drugs and roll it out in CVS and Walgreens on the weekend and say after the people die, we would never say like, well, hey, that's just chemistry. So the question to me is, why do we let the big tech industry get away with that kind of thinking and that kind of rationale? And that's a double click.
It's beta.
I have a question about
people, but it's beta.
Interesting thing about like tobacco.
Really soon too.
The tobacco change was really driven. A lot of people. It came less from the government, right? It kind of bubbled up from the health community. The drunk driving stuff bubbled up from Mothers Against Drunk Driving. In the world of tech, maybe the last people I would trust to know how to regulate it would be congressmen and senators that barely understand an algorithm. So one of the questions is, how is it that a community of people who understand technology and understand social issues might come up with candidates or algorithms or mechanisms? I mean, because it's really some set of code and some set of approaches that's being proposed, right? So if we're not expecting it to come down from a congressman, but it strikes me there's a more fluid way of accomplishing this than just lobbying, because you're talking about other technical mechanisms. So can you maybe guide us through what a change might look like, or how your community and other people who are in communities might organize to begin to change this?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's a great question. And I think that we have a number of community organizers around the United States and outside of the US who are doing tremendous work. I think here in Los Angeles, just about the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition that did so much work around things like predictive policing and surveillance of poor people, and the way in which predictive policing, for example, used these data sets to train its algorithms based on past arrests. And of course, that means if you live in a community or a neighborhood in LA where is over arresting, or there's been more surveillance than, let's say, in Beverly Hills or on the west side of LA, then you know that the algorithm is going to predict that more crime is going to happen in these places where more surveillance has happened in the past, or more arrests have happened in the past. That has not necessarily correlating to where crime is, because we certainly know there's a lot of white collar crime that isn't getting arrested all over LA. So the question is, what role these incredible organizations have played in surfacing and making visible what they know. And of course, researchers, we do a really important role in documenting and making visible the kinds of things that we can study in a concentrated way, in a systematic way, to show how disparity works. In big tobacco, it was public health researchers and public health community organizations who joined forces and made legislatures around the country and Congress deal with these issues. And so I think we still have very powerful models, and there are people working in these spaces, Cathy and I notwithstanding, I mean, and many others, some others. And I think that, our work is increasingly being married up with community-based organizations. And it is not for a lack of knowledge. It is for a lack of will.
It is not. It's will. I love this comment. Wait, actually, I want to bring Cathy in because, some of this stuff, I just heard you say something about the LAPD spying and the predictive policing and training data. And I don't know that everybody understands quite what even training data is. And I think there's another layer to this that has to do with false positives versus false negatives. Some things can be, the risk of ruin can be very great for people that are marginalized. The risk of ruin for a false positive for somebody who, like, maybe they're worried about recidivism and going back into the prisons could be really significant to people. And yet the algorithms often, that are made by people don't really weigh this. And I think that's something that Cathy has studied quite a lot. Excuse me. Cathy, I just want to pull you in on this. And I don't know, Peter, where your question is going, but I'd love, wait, first, Peter, where do you want to go? But let's
no.
Cathy.
You were actually going down a wonderful. Cathy has written some amazing stuff about exactly what goes on with predictive policing, which we think is this amazing new thing, but actually it takes the easy way out and does weird stuff. So this is a great question. I was going to actually ask, coming out of all of this, where is the greatest potential hazard, moral hazard, as we start rebuilding? Where education's going online, work's going online. So I'm just interested where, after COVID, we're most worried. But I think what you're setting up with Cathy is great.
Yeah, no. So Cathy, first, I just love your book. I'm a big fan. And thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about weapons of math destruction, and how these things have suddenly shown up, and your own role and exploration of this.
Well, I want to thank you for having me. And I just wanted to say, I just agreed with everything Safiya just said. So I'm so honored to be on the show with her. I think I'm going to back up a little bit and just say, and this is like a confession, to be honest, one of my jobs is to explain that exactly what Safiya just said. This is not math. This is not math. This uses math as an authority, as a sort of shield to prevent people from asking questions.
It's almost scientism, not science.
Exactly. It's like, do you have a PhD in math? If you don't have a PhD in math, you don't have the right to ask questions about this algorithm that is sending you to jail, or this algorithm that is firing you, or this algorithm that is not giving you an interview for this job that you're qualified for. There is, of course, math at some level, and when you build algorithms with training data, and I am going to get to that. But it's not math itself. And I say that as a mathematician. And so the confession is that one of the reasons people listen to me is that I have a PhD in math from Harvard. It's very certified. There's so much about this, and this goes back to Safiya's comment about the ethics washing. In some sense, people cannot stand the fact that I am a mathematician saying these things because it's just so unnerving to them. So they would rather I just don't exist. But the truth is, I'm a mathematician. I became a quantum finance. I joined Occupy. I became a data scientist after being really disgusted by what I saw the role of mathematicians or mathematical modeling in the financial crisis. And then I saw the same exact thing unfolding in the field of data science. This was back in 2011, 2012, when we trusted data scientists, when we thought Silicon Valley really was trying to make the world a better place. I mean, I admit to myself to sort of buying that. And what I realized is, this is, again, we are using the authority of mathematics to make the indefensible seem not only defensible, but inevitable, which is exactly what we see happening right now, connecting to Peter's question, going on with the tech giants' consolidation of power through the COVID crisis. So going back to your question about training data, first I want to just really quickly tell you what an algorithm is, because it's always framed as this unbelievably complicated thing that nobody can understand. It's not. It's really, really stupid. It's pattern matching. So you start with an initial condition and you're in the historical data, did this initial condition lead to success or did it lead to failure? So in order to, and you pattern match that, you're how about this initial condition? How about this initial condition? How about this initial condition? And the algorithm uses the training data, which is the historical information you have, and the definition of success, which is sometimes called the objective function. And it just says, okay, I have seen like thousands, if not tens of thousands of examples of initial conditions that sometimes led to success and sometimes didn't. And now when you present me a new set of initial conditions, I can tell you the probability it will lead to success, because I will tell you that I've seen like lots of close by, nearby, very similar types of initial conditions, and that on average, those led to success or didn't. And that's it. That's the whole thing. And you can see, so the example I usually use is like making dinner for my kids. It doesn't have to be formal. Like, did this set of, food items lead to success for my family's dinner? Of course, what does success mean? For me, it means did my kids eat vegetables? For my kids, it means did we eat, did we have Nutella, if it's my youngest son? And so you can see that agendas are built into the definition of success, the actual objective function. Another example I like to give is Facebook's definition of success for the Facebook newsfeed is, does it keep people on Facebook? That's it. How long can you keep people on Facebook? And the answer is, if you get them into really bad arguments, they stay longer. I mean, that's it. Like, so you're going to privilege things that keep people arguing. So that's the objective function. In terms of the other ingredient, there's literally only two ingredients for algorithms. So the other ingredient is training data. What are you feeding this very naive, stupid pattern matching thing? And the answer is like, well, it only knows what you're feeding it. So it only knows this initial condition, success, yes or no. Going to predictive policing, Safiya said it very well. We don't have the training data. We don't have crime data. That's how I frame it. Like, it's actually offensive to many criminologist ears, the way I say it, but we pretend we have crime data by saying, well, we have arrest data. And of course, we do have arrest data. We know where we've arrested people. And so what these predictive policing, hotspot policing also called, which is used in every major city in this country, what they do is they look at the sort of the area, the location of arrests, and send cops there looking for more crime. And I'm using my words carefully. We start with arrests, send cops to those locations to have more crime. And because we've had historically over-policed neighborhoods in Black and brown communities and poor Black and brown communities, we are simply perpetuating that sort of cycle of over-policing. Because of course, when you send a lot of cops to a certain neighborhood looking for crime, especially if they mistreat and stop and frisk, then they're going to find people to arrest, and then it's going to be evidence. I put it in quotes of, yes, this was success. This is the definition of success in that situation. Did you get to arrest somebody again after you looked for crime? But I want you to close your eyes, if you will, because I like the thought experiment, and imagine what it would look like if we did have data on crimes. Like, what would it look like if we had data on crimes? And sometimes when I ask an audience to think about this, I ask them a slightly dual thing. I ask them to raise their hand if they've ever met anyone who smoked pot and didn't get arrested. And obviously they're like, oh, I smoked pot last week and I didn't get arrested. Like, they realize that is a very, very unlikely arrest, especially for the audience I speak to, which are mostly like well-off, educated white people. And yet, like, we have, and actually we have pretty good data on pot smoking. We have data that white people and Black people, smoke pot at similar rates, actually, at high rates and similar rates. And we also have the data that Black people and brown people get arrested 4 to 5 times more often. And this is true throughout decades of information, which is to say, just to tell you how bad a proxy arrest data is for crime data, that we have a bias, a racial bias in that crime category of a 5 to 1, 4 to 1 or 5 to 1. Wow. And sometimes much, much worse than that in certain precincts, in certain areas. If you look at rape, you realize, like, close your eyes again, how many rape events result in arrests? Because again, that's what predictive policing is based on, arrests. How many rape events result in arrests? Well, we know that rape is deeply underreported. We don't even know how badly it is, but let's say 20% of rapes are reported. That's actually an overestimate. 7% of reported rapes lead to arrest. 7%. So if you think about the set of rapes, and then you compare that to the set of arrests for rapes, you realize that these two data sets have no relationship to each other. So anyway, my point is that we have this is what I would call a proxy problem, or a missing data problem. Like, it's a bad proxy. We have no good proxy for crime. We're pretending we do. And when we pretend we do, we have an enormous bias that we're ignoring. And then when we ignore that enormous bias and use these algorithms as if they are true, they're objective truth, then we're perpetuating inequality.
But Cathy, actually, I love this. Peter and I are both just going to be champing at the bit to ask questions. But in a sense, what you're creating, you're identifying, though, and we've talked a little bit about system theory and complex systems, is a feedback loop. Like, yes. if you fire a whole bunch of teachers and then you go, hey, we got rid of all the bad teachers, except for, you create, basically, it's like, oh, now you've now made that teacher feel like they're a bad teacher, or they can't get hired the next time. And you create a negative feedback loop towards unemployment, or a negative feedback loop towards, we should, just because obviously if they're arrested so much, they must be bad people, so let's arrest more. And it's a classic kind of feedback loop.
I mean, it perpetuates stigma, to be honest. As Safiya said, go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt. I was about to ask. Let me throw a question out. So about 10 years ago, 11, 12 years ago, when during the Obama administration, when cities and the federal government were opening up data, right, the whole open data movement, there was fair amount of activism around that. In San Francisco, when we opened up the crime data or the transportation data or the food desert data, and we were running lots of hackathons and lots of community events. And what I found encouraging is all of this open data was kind of an invitation. We had activists and urbanists and journalists all come in and, starting to do oversight. You would see that arrests in Oakland for prostitution were made once a month from north to south on one avenue, and realized that wasn't a crime. That was just police acting a certain way. And it started a real good community conversation. And likewise, you could figure out which communities did not have access to fresh food. You could start trying to work around that with code. And it feels like there was a civic engagement, a public engagement, and maybe more so in San Francisco because they're a bunch of geeks, that I feel like there's a little bit less of now. And I guess the question I'm asking is, how do we fire this back up to a sense of civics so that the community is aware of this and ask questions, and there's a literacy around this stuff, or even teach this stuff in middle schools? We're teaching kids math, but maybe not civics. But this is like the coolest way of learning math and science, because there's a sense of agency that, look, here's what's going on. You don't even know about it. And I'm just wondering if there are mechanisms that can just make this part of the conversation that then will drive both political response and corporate responsibility.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to push back a little bit.
Okay.
I'll start with the good news. I was introduced to stop and frisk data at a hackathon, and it changed my life. So that's great.
You thought it was good, or you realized this was the worst thing in the world?
No, it was great, but it was very rare data set. It was court ordered after a huge lawsuit by the NYCLU.
And freedom of information and things like that.
And the whole point of the hackathon that I was in charge of, because I was the data scientist in charge of my group, was it was intentionally given to NYCLU in a format that they couldn't open, and in files that was proprietary formatting. And so the whole point of the weekend was to just try to open this with open source software. I worked in the Bloomberg administration. I saw many examples of inconvenient to political data being shut down. Bloomberg is famous for being the data oriented mayor, but he doesn't like bad news, and to the point of the civic data, I love the idea, but my experience in civic sort of hackathon type data is they will show you information about tree pruning, but they will not show you which badge numbers were the ones that were the most violent or most often stop and frisking. They protect certain people and they do not protect other people. So for me, it was the most interesting data is not open. The data about powerful people tends not to be open. The data about powerless people tends to be not only open, but purchasable and in very convenient formatting for, as Safiya said, for predatory advertising. I mean, and by the way, I just want to say my origin story, if you don't mind, really quickly about my book. I was working as a data scientist in online advertising. For something I thought was relatively benign, a venture capitalist came to our company telling us about his vision of the future of online advertising. And this line I will remember forever. His line was, "I can't wait for the day when all I see are trips to Aruba and jet skis, and I never again have to see another University of Phoenix ad, because those aren't for people like me." And everyone around me laughed. And I was like, oh my God, like this is an intentional goal of segregation by class, by gender, by race. And this guy doesn't want to be down with the little people. He wants tailored advertising to be a feature for him, making lucky people luckier, if you will. And he wants other people to be preyed upon. There's so many examples. I could go on for quite a bit of how that is essentially the business model of the internet. And I was doing it. I mean, that's when I quit my job there, because I was like, wait a second, I'm really good at my job. I'm a very good data scientist. And what that means is I'm really good at figuring out who deserves opportunities. And who are those people? Rich people. It was high value customers, offer them good stuff. Lower value customers, offer them bad stuff. I mean, that is the whole model. I mean, in a nutshell.
It seems you did leave that though because of that kind of realization.
I didn't want to be part of that. Yeah.
Just don't want to be a part of that. You know, what I think is interesting here is this notion that the powerful people, the data not only is not available or purchasable, but it's obfuscated. It's you wouldn't even know it exists in some ways. And then
there's an entire industry like reputation.com, an entire industry that for a fee will hide inconvenient information for rich people. That just doesn't exist for other people, as Safiya's research proves.
Right. And
I was thinking, I'm curious about what your reactions, Cathy, to Safiya's comments about sort of the case for tech reparations, or like, how do we actually level the field again? What's your kind of reaction to Safiya's comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to absolutely echo Safiya's comments on the East Coast. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to be an advisor for people opening a data science institute, and then find out that the only people they're ever going to hire to run that are people that have absolutely sold themselves to partnerships with Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Facebook. Until one of those places hires Safiya, I'd have doubts about them. And I don't think Stanford made that offer. Stanford did not make that offer. Okay. So it is an absolute effort to push back on the voices that they're hearing that are inconvenient to their business model, but not to actually change things. So I want to say that the political will isn't there. But having said that, like, I actually started a company that audits algorithms. What I do is I go into companies, I get total access to their algorithms with an NDA, and I help them think through, is your algorithm racist? Yes, it always is, because data is. It's always embedded and echoed in data, and since they're using data, it's going to be there. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to make your model not only legally compliant, which is always like a sort of a minefield. That's something.
Well, also legal is like the least. Like, how can we make it the most racist that legal will allow? Is so sad,
and that is a real problem. That is actually a real problem, especially in hiring. There are like pretty bad standards, but I gotta say, at least there are standards. In other places, there's like, what is the standard? With respect to hiring, there's something called the 4/5 rule, which is basically like saying you can be 20% racist if you'd like, which is to say you can like only offer 80% as many jobs to people of this ethnicity as to white people or whatever. But with respect to advertising for jobs, as far as I can tell, there are no rules. And that is a problem.
Yeah.
I would like LinkedIn to hire me to audit their matchmaking services. They haven't hired me. So like, again, I'm coming across a political problem, which is that we are still living in the era of plausible deniability. These big tech companies like to think of themselves as good guys, and they like to think of themselves as like not intentionally doing anything wrong, and their lawyers haven't told them to start worrying yet. So they haven't really felt, and the regulators haven't figured out how to regulate them yet. So there's really no actual pressure. There can be, by the way, going to the question that I feel coming up, COVID with the, with the like reconsolidation of the power here, it's going to be less pressure to worry about these kinds of issues.
It's an emergency. Emergency is a great time for bad things.
Having said that, I would just like to finish by saying it is not technically impossible to address this. It is technically quite possible. It is technically feasible to address these questions. It is just simply not convenient to the people that make money from it.
Yeah. And I suspect, I mean, there might be all sorts of ways to actually create a better society where people are well off and have more ethical practices. It's just that we slowly kind of accept everything. And authoritarians and dictators love times of emergency because now is the time to suspend civil liberties. It's a great time to do it.
That's right.
Because we're fighting the COVID enemy or something. Safiya, you look like you've been trying to get in on this, and I want to ask you to come in, and we're coming up on the top of the hour, and we always keep running for overtime. But I also want to give both of you an opportunity to, if you have to bail at the top of the hour, please do. And we're going to add links to all the things that you've been talking about to our resources page on quarantine.today, because I think it is required reading for everyone watching the show to read both of your books and to follow what's happening next. Safiya, what did you want to say? Or what was your reaction?
The things are being said that need to be said, and this is one of the reasons why I appreciate you so much, Cathy, because I feel like different bodies and different degrees and expertise and positions in our society get to say different things that can be taken up, and this is why all of our voices together are so important, including people working in community organizations who are on the front lines of taking so many, again, of the hits of what anti-democratic politics and abuses of power look like. And so, there's certainly, I think the challenge here, when I was thinking, Cathy, I'm just like, I'm not going to sleep tonight thinking about your example of the VC coming in to do the targeted advertising, because to me, this is actually what's at stake is not just the targeted advertising, it's the over-determination of what our futures will look like using these technologies that are embedded and ubiquitous and are all around us and that are very difficult to disengage from, because more and more companies and institutions are using them as a proxy for engagement or democracy or connection. And I think about these kinds of things all the time. I was at a meeting once, and I heard at a conference, and I heard the director of the FBI say that as far as the state was concerned, we are our data profile. And when you think about the implications of what that means, that every digital trace that any of us or our family members or people we know or our social networks have ever had making up the so-called reality of who we are, and then using that to predict what possibilities can be available to us, whether it's jobs, whether it's housing, whether it's the kinds of schools your kids will get into, whether you should be invested in to get a vaccination or not. I mean, these are very real-time issues that are in front of us right now, and it seems like
I worry so much about what you're saying. What freaks me out about this, we need to ring the alarm. And what freaks me out about this is that, in a sense, if we are telling people your data is what you are, we are shutting down all the crazy possibilities of what people could be. Someone, whether it was Ben Franklin or Joseph Priestley or someone else, everyone quotes three people, I think, for everything in the past. One said, when someone looked at a hot air balloon and they said, this looks totally useless, and Ben Franklin said, well, what's the purpose of a newborn child? And the idea was, we don't know yet. when someone is born and they happen to be in the minority or in the underserved or the marginalized community, we treat them as a deficit. And that's so weird because every human is effectively a badass. I mean, you don't out-survive 3 billion years of evolution to show up here today as an apex predator, frankly, and then say this person's a deficit. They're a badass by definition. I mean, I think some massive percentage of all life on Earth is extinct. And yet, we're here, and this child who is just coming up and wants to even learn about who they are, if they Google, they find out that they're apparently just predetermined to be a porn star, or they're predetermined to go to jail or something. We are just shutting down all these horizons. And I think that's the world is going to rue the day that really happens. It's already happening. I'm just freaked out by this.
Let me just say, I think while there might be some who hold people of color or LGBTQ women in a position of thinking of us as in the deficit, I will argue and have the evidence to prove that most of these platforms built themselves off the backbone of our culture, the distribution of culture, the commodification of our culture. So it's interesting that how, for example, during this pandemic, TikTok is on the rise because of the Savage Challenge and now Beyonce and Megan Thee Stallion Challenge and all of the ways in which Black popular culture gets commodified to blow up these platforms, the decimation of Black life, hate against our communities, becomes the most viral, titillating kind of content to move through Facebook and other kinds of platforms. So it's interesting contradiction that while we are somehow outside of the systems of relief, we are the fodder for commodification and huge profits for these platforms too.
Well, and I think you mentioned that you're growing up. You saw often people in the African American community being the first adopters of weird, interesting tech, just to explore their lives and do things, right? And it's just so that's the danger here, is this treating people like deficits instead of like possibilities. And just opening that up, and the naivety that because it has this patina of science, because it's an algorithm, as Cathy said, well, that seems pretty believable. It's got a number there, and I'm not so comfortable with numbers, so it must be true. And it's kind of just that we don't even want to question our own assumptions. We've got Michael Kleeman here, and I'd like to bring Michael in if we could. Hey, Omid, if you can bring in Michael. So Michael he's a friend of mine who has been on the board of the Institute for the Future and has been working for a number of years as a volunteer with the American Red Cross. And in his retirement, Michael was telling me the other day that he's probably putting in about 14-hour days trying to be an advisor to the leadership there about what the heck to prepare for in the next month or the next week. Because the Red Cross is a massively distributed, hyper-local organization. There are chapters across the country, and they have to be ready for this. And they're incredible executors. And so, Michael, what's your reaction to this? I mean, what would a scenario planning thing look like to actually help with what Safiya and Cathy have identified? And then tell us a little bit about what maybe one of our future episodes on foresight might hold.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you both. The conversation is really an important one. It would be useful to have algorithms, but one of the things that for some of the stuff we do, and in fact, we're beginning to look at how do we begin to profile communities for social and economic risk, so that when there is a disaster, we make sure that aid goes to places that really need it. And one of the problems with that, as both of you understand, is you have to believe the underlying data, and your algorithms need to be transparent and really do what they say they're going to do. And one of the risks is, as we're using metrics like social determinants of health. And one of the risks when we start looking at that, as any community looking at that, is, are we getting the factors right? And are we getting the algorithms right? And have they really been tested in any objective way? One scenario I would throw out to you that is a little bit disturbing, if you think about the applications on your mobile phone, the people that write those applications, quote unquote, actually write only around 5% of the code that's running. The rest of it are library calls and APIs. And what will happen, here's a scenario. In a future world where some of the biased algorithms that the two of you are identifying and questioning end up embedded as lower level calls that have no transparency whatsoever and become normative, either because the government requires it, but you'll never ever be able to see what's underlying or audit them the way that Cathy's been able to do. And it becomes
if you don't mind, I'm gonna push
Go ahead,
back a little bit. I do think you can audit them. If you can ask a question, you can make a black box answer the question. So I feel like I think it's going too far. I agree that there's a lot of code that we don't quite understand. I also just wanted to make one more comment to your work, Michael, which is I hope going to be making you feel a little bit better. One of the things I always ask when I audit an algorithm is, for whom does this fail? Really, essentially the only question I ever ask, to be honest. And can we think of a stakeholder that is really getting harmed? And the flip side of that is, if this is offering support to people, like there's a really different ethical valence to some people didn't get as much support as they needed versus some people were punished unfairly. So if I'm just saying, like, you can't really audit an algorithm without the context. Like, let me reframe it this way. Think of an algorithm that predicts diabetes risk. By the way, there are algorithms that predict diabetes risk. Those are being built. They have been built. If your doctor uses that to help you stay healthy, that's a good thing. If an insurance company uses that to price you out of insurance, that's evil. So what I always try to remind people of is, like, are you making lucky people luckier and unlucky people unluckier?
Oh, wow.
If so, you're doing it wrong. What you want to be asking is, are you making unlucky people luckier? And so, Michael, to your point, you can't ever make it unbiased. That's impossible. But you can ask, are we making unlucky people unluckier, or are we making unlucky people luckier? And like, that is like a very shorthand version of like a litmus test for the kind of algorithm audit that I conduct.
Oh, wow.
So
Those are
good test.
Yeah. So, Michael, why do you believe? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Safiya.
If I may, because I think one of the challenges here too is that the technology and our kind of fixation on its ability to help us make better predictions, like are we distributing aid to people who are in crisis? Are we distributing PPP, SBA loans to people who really need them? Or are we giving them to the Lakers, right? The questions, like the questions that center the efficacy of the algorithm, also preclude our ability to ask the questions like, why do these people need aid? What have we done about how we've organized the distribution of resources in our society that makes it that there will always be a permanent underclass of people, or that there will always be refugees, or that there will always be people who we need to better predict survival necessities to, or not. Those are the kinds of questions that I think concern me about, again, our obsession with perfecting the technology. It creates a new market opportunity based on the exploitation of people, rather than backing up and saying, could we apply algorithms to thinking about how we would redistribute resources? Should we look at algorithms that ask us, how do we deliver coronavirus vaccinations that would be predicated upon a public health model, rather than Google and Apple better tracking us? I mean, the fundamental questions, I think, are sometimes the wrong questions. And these are I guess, going back to Peter's earlier question or provocation to us, and I'm really interested, Michael, what you think about this. How does this kind of tension around scenario prediction stifle our ability or not to ask other kinds of questions about the structure?
I think actually, and that will cue up the thing that you asked about, Mickey. I think the answer, I believe, is that if you construct scenarios the right way and you create a set of broad potential futures that you can examine and look at the ramifications, you can at least try to understand what the downstream implications of some of these things are. And the idea about doing scenarios the right way is to make certain that you don't a priori bias the future by your own beliefs, but let it be driven by the data. And sadly, if you're looking at socioeconomic issues in any country, but especially this one, you have to take a look at the starting point. And then in the case of COVID, we have to look at kinds of disproportionate negative impacts that are likely to occur and make sure you illuminate those and highlight those as part of the scenario. You know, we're already starting off with communities that are depressed. This will only make those things worse, right?
Yeah.
And I think we're trying to get a handle on it.
I like Safiya's frame on the sort of, the problem is, why the hell were they bad in the first place? And there's this underlying issue. But I think to your point, Michael, and I think just for everyone the viewing, we're hoping to have an upcoming episode on foresight. Tell us, Michael, and I know you have to leave. Why is foresight different than futurist, or than forecast? And why is this actually something that you're really passionate about? In your third chapter here, and trying to explore.
So I'm not certain I believe in any futurists. And in fact, I think that most futurists are purely technological optimists that largely ignore humanity. And you could look at all the wonderful futurists that are coming out there, and I've yet to see one that deals with the downside of the technologies and what it's brought us to, et cetera, or incorporates any political realities. They tend to be what I refer to, as I said earlier, as technological optimists. Foresight, I think, is a very different art. It assumes that you can't predict the future, first of all, but you can only identify plausible futures that allow you, if you will, to sort of envision them and swim in those future potentials, and try to understand how things might be different, so that you can better plan for those potentials, and maybe where we have the ability to impact those futures, work now to positively impact them. And to me, it's almost like
running for ahead and then chaining backward and saying, okay, that future, this could happen, and this is the second and third order effect. Let's run this way. Okay, that future, that could happen. If we were to sort of backward chain back, what could we do different that would be a little lever towards a better future?
Exactly, and we call that backcasting.
Yeah, okay.
Michael, I have a question on the inclusiveness of scenario planning, because part of this whole conversation is about the fact that kind of a very small group of insiders kind of decided what the tech landscape was. So they might have been doing scenario planning, but it wouldn't have been diverse, or had people who were saying, well, why are you doing it that way? And as we start heading into this kind of next realm of coming out of this, how do we ensure that this form of thinking is done in as broad a based way, with community engagement and student engagement and more eyes on it, so that we don't regard it as some black box and then end up once again with reinforcing what we don't like?
Absolutely. I think you gave the answer, frankly. What we're trying to do on the scenario planning we're doing is we're incorporating input from around 40 nations around the world, from people with different socioeconomic status. And then we're using a larger group of 100 people in a Delphi process to help comment and revisit it. It's going to be imperfect, but it'll be better than just having, if you will, my favorite phrase about the UI we use on our computers, something that was invented by a bunch of upper middle class white boys in Palo Alto in the late 1970s, right? Yeah. And so I regret I have to go, but
yeah.
I was going to say,
Michael,
thank you, and we will continue this. And you put a really provocative thought earlier in our brains, which is this with quarantine here, which has been kind of a conversation in a bit of a broadcast mode. This can become kind of a broader scenario planning concept for what's being built, whether it's supply chain or cities inclusively. because
Yes.
that's what's needed now, and
Yeah.
that's what our audience cares about.
Well, and particularly the Red Cross. I mean, I think it's just so underappreciated what it's out there doing every day, and we really appreciate you being involved in volunteering and helping out with that.
And my colleagues that do all that work as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to make a
Thank
point
you,
about.
Cathy.
Thanks.
Nice to meet you, Michael.
I want to make a point about feedback loops. One of the interesting things about what's gone on the last couple of weeks is we talked about the PPP legislation, like not really helping those who might need it the most. That legislation was passed, and like since everyone's watching the news every day, everybody realized about a week later that it went to a bunch of rich companies, and that and like the next day Congress got together and like, we better fix that. And from the president on down, it's like, give back the money, we have to do it differently. That was an interesting example of everybody paying attention, and both the Republicans and the Democrats knowing everybody's looking at them, and stuff changed quickly. And I'm just wondering, coming out of all of this, are there hopeful examples of things that we can reinforce that might lead to more eyes on things? And there is this narrative that says, well, gee, we now actually do care more about government involvement. We care more about inclusiveness. If things are really bad and the government doesn't want people to get thrown out of their apartments or have their electricity turned off, why don't we do that, like in general? So is this a more fluid moment to introduce these things, or are we falsely optimistic right now?
I'm going to jump on that because I am writing a book about shame as a social mechanism.
Yeah.
So I have like a very involved, possibly overly involved theory of shame. When it works, when it doesn't. When is it a good idea? When is it just making money for a corporation? And yeah, I agree with you that it kind of worked, but not completely, because if it had truly worked, we probably would have had more of a reaction to bail out people who cannot meet their rent this month, next month, and not just a rent freeze, but like an actual forgiveness of rent and other kinds of debt, including student debt. Like, how far do you want to go? So it worked in a certain way. The question of whether it's too optimistic to think that it'll continue to work, I don't think so. I am slightly optimistic. I'm writing an essay right now called "Well, we should welcome our algorithmic overlords with pitchforks," where I try to make the case that there is room for optimism right now, and it's in part because, let me put it this way: I was an occupier. Occupy ultimately did not have enough momentum to directly affect policy, although I do think it has indirectly affected a lot of things. I think the momentum that we're about to see from 30% unemployment of a bunch of people who will be expecting help, will have solidarity with each other, and have just seen trillions of dollars of bailouts for other things besides themselves, will be very potent. And so I do think that the potential for what I call punching up shame, which is when you hold people to account, people in power, I think the potential for punching up shame is really, really great, and a little bit scary, but kind of exciting.
You mentioned when we talked earlier about the essay you're working on, that we should welcome our algorithmic overlords with pitchforks. You said you had sort of 3 key points that you were thinking about.
Yeah,
Can you just elaborate, because one of them was a little bit about the Occupy side and what you saw there. Can you hit on those 3 points?
Yeah, I mean, I just mentioned them briefly, but I'll say them again. The first one is, like, we have a bunch of people who just sort of violently got thrown out of work all at the same time. So there is solidarity in that. And they know who each other is. And they were colleagues, so they know they're talking. That's a little bit different from the sort of historical picture that we had of like slow offshoring, like one company at a time. That's the
but
first
I think,
thing.
and you mentioned in this solidarity thing, I think you said, like, the point is they didn't do anything wrong.
That's the second point. That's the second point.
Okay, tell me more about that.
These are people who do not feel shamed. Like, what we usually do is we shame poor people. We shame people who are not working. We force them into all sorts of humiliating postures and behaviors in order to qualify for help. And these are people who are like, wait a second, this was a natural disaster, it had nothing to do with me. All of my friends and I are very good at our job. We want to be working and we have no shame. And it is ineffective to try to humiliate us. So they will be asking and demanding more. And they will be a political force with a political voice. And the final thing was that thing where like, wait a second, you just managed to conjure up $3 trillion last week for your buddies. How about another $3 trillion for something that's useful to us and to frontline workers and to meat processing plant workers and all the other people we see dying at their jobs.
So it's almost like we can see that you can actually take action. If you're, that's the part I want to make sure I got.
Sort of like, how can we afford this is no longer an argument.
Yeah, that's kind of an erroneous argument. I just love it.
Like, it's so easy to see that now.
I feel like, well, I want to give you all the chance to have an evening too, because
it's great to talk to you.
I've hit the Chardonnays. So,
and I ran out of wine, so I kind of got to go.
If I can
Kathy.
One thought.
Sophia.
I mean, first of all, Kathy, I can't wait to read your new book and this essay because it's so important. And, I love your work. And, I just want to say that one of the things that the PPP failure also shows is that, for example, the way in which the racial wealth gap in the United States works also works through these federal administrative apparati that unevenly distribute the largesse of public wealth and health and well-being. And so this is not unlike things like FHA loans that went to veterans returning from the war, and the way in which Black and Latino families and vets couldn't get those loans. And so the uneven distribution of these loans is also racialized. And one of the things that I noticed as I was talking to friends who were applying for these funds is that, our family barber can't get those loans because guess what? He doesn't use QuickBooks to run his operation, and he doesn't pay himself on a payroll that uses the kinds of forms that the government requires. So there's certain kinds of administrative apparati, apparatuses that preclude the people who need it the most. How are local artists supposed to apply for PPP support when they don't have a certain type of books to justify that? That doesn't mean that their work is any less important and crucial. And so I think that cultural arts workers, I think people of color, independent contractors, 1099 workers, these folks, the largesse of these programs is not supporting them. It is not helping them. And so this, I think, is we're going to look at with a retrospect and say this has exacerbated the racial wealth gap that we already know the studies shows would take 400 years to close on the current course that we're on. We need radical public policy changes and a really different imaginary to go into the future if we don't want to see the bottom truly fall out of this country and others.
I agree completely.
I think you're totally right, and I'm hearing it from just friends, family, artists, across the country. Peter had his internet problems just now, so he just dropped off. But first, it looks like he's coming back. I really want to thank you both for coming today. I just appreciate it. This is sort of like we put you on the spot. We're like, come in, and we're really glad you did, because we want to get what you've been doing and all the people that, Safiya, you've talked about a number of people. I'd like just more visibility to this, the wonderful efforts that people are doing. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, guys. It's great.
Yeah, I love it.
We're all thrilled to be here.
I'm hoping
to see you, Cathy.
Yeah.
I'm hoping to continue this conversation in the future. And we do want to have one on scenario and forecast or scenario planning, just to broaden it, but only because of system thinking. I believe it's really good to not be surprised so much by when weird things happen, or be surprised by the bad things too late, that we can take action. And so I've become a fan of at least saying, let's at least surprise ourselves before we get surprised by something else. And I just think the points I heard For whom does this fail? I think what Cathy said. I think that's a really interesting question to ask, and everyone should be asking this as a data scientist, as a business person, as just a citizen. And are you making unlucky people luckier? Because we, in some ways, we need a chance sometimes. There's a field of economics called ergodic economics, ergodicity, which has to do with looking at the ensemble average. Like, look at 100 people spending $1 in Las Vegas, and as the casinos, maybe 50% of the chance, or 60% you make money and 40% you don't, it looks pretty good. Or if the GDP says we're at this rate, if you look at the ensemble, it could be 1 or 2 billionaires and a whole bunch of people making no money, and the GDP went up. And so there's a danger in classic economic thinking that believes that the ensemble is the same, it's symmetric to the individual. But we don't live in infinite multiple worlds and parallel worlds. And so the risk of ruin is very high for people. And it's that idea that the GDP is a terrible measure because a few trillionaires could offset everybody that make no money. And if we flip it to like sort of the democratic what's the domestic product, which is a philosophy that like Nicholas Taleb and Old Peters and other economists are forcing us to look at. It actually says, don't look at the ensemble, look at everybody's income and average that, because one person going to zero would collapse this, or a few people would bring it down, instead of saying look at the average of everybody. And that would be a far more democratic kind of approach. That's for the future, but lots to read. And if you haven't read Cathy and Safiya's books, and if you don't subscribe to their Twitter feeds and pay attention to what they're talking about, you're probably an idiot. Please do. And or you just didn't hear about it. And I feel like I'm both of those. So I'm so excited that you were able to spend time with us.
Thanks for having
me. I think we should wrap up.
Okay.
I will. Let's tease. So first of all, thank you. This stuff is foundational in that, as you've pointed out, we often don't even realize it, and it perpetuates the inequality that we profess to not want. And what do we do about it? So this was both great, and it gives us a lot to think about, because the entry point about where to put change. Cathy, you point out that even in the case of the Bloomberg administration, where you had people who professed the love of data and you had elected officials, so there was a feedback loop there, things were obfuscated, and it only gets tougher in the private sector. So this is, it's a privilege to introduce this conversation, especially as we try to interweave it with conversations to come. As Mickey pointed out, for the next few weeks, we're really going to be on this hunt of the world that we want to build and what comes next. On Wednesday, we're going to talk about California, China, and the global supply chain. One of the things that was most interrupted in all this was international trade, both because it stopped and people stopped working, and because of political tensions, and because of the realization that, kind of from a systems point of view, our international trade system wasn't really that resilient. It optimized for economic efficiency, but not redundancy. And then you suddenly realize that critical things that we rely on need to come from China, including pharmaceuticals. So we're going to get into that with Darlene Chu Bryant, who leads San Francisco's International Trade Organization, Global SF. San Francisco, sits at a crossroads with Asia, and the question is, do we have to have our own foreign policy in California because perhaps the national government is less enamored of trade? How do you have international trade but also local manufacturing and local resilience? If you look at what real estate people think is to come, the people are very bullish on manufacturing in America. So how do you get that balanced? We'll also have Nadia Hewitt, who's with the World Economic Forum, and so she will be bringing to us next week a study that they have put together on where they think global trade and the supply chain is going. And the key headline there is also, it's about data transparency. If you actually shared information and knew what was going on, you might be able to prevent some of these shocks, but we don't. And then Hans Galan runs a logistics company, a startup in the United States, that's also looking at some of these data inequalities. So that is on Wednesday. Friday, we're going to take a look at the future the future of cities. You know, the future of cities was everything. Everyone's moving to cities. We're excited about them, but maybe not so. Maybe not so if we're worried about density. We're worried about mass transit. We realize we don't need dense downtowns to go to work. And so what happens next? And we'll be doing that with Kent Larson, who leads city sciences at MIT, and with my friend Nigel Jacob, who leads the New Urban Mechanics Lab, one of the leading urban data labs in Boston, whom we can also talk to about, is the bad data obfuscated or not? And then we think we'll have one of the top city planning people who's been responsible for some of the more interesting developments, transit-oriented dense development in our cities, talking about what's going to happen next. So that's next week. And then we're going to continue on the innovation hunt after that. So we'll be back next week with episode 14 of Quarantine on international trade and then on cities. Thank you so much for joining us. And as you can see, we are kind of like connecting with where this whole conversation is going as we move from staying home to what do we come out to and how do we design it for a better world. So have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again to everyone who's joined us, and to Drew Youngs, who is the creator of all of our music on this show, to Mohib, who was one of our technical directors, to Omid Manicherry, our executive producer, and to Mia and Anna, who also helped bring the show together. And to all of you, thank you. Have a great weekend. It is now 5:32 Pacific Quarantine.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. Now we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.